The transport ship rocked beneath their feet as 23 German women descended into the cargo hold, their wrists still bearing the pale marks of temporary restraints. It was October 1944, and Elsa Müller pressed her forehead against the cold metal wall, trying to steady her breathing. 24 years old, trained as a nurse in Hamburg, she had never imagined her war would end like this, captured during a field hospital evacuation near the French border, now crossing an ocean toward a land she had been taught to fear. "They will starve us," whispered Greta Hoffmann, a former radio operator whose hands trembled constantly since her capture. "I heard the guards talking. Americans hate us. They will make us pay for everything." Elsa said nothing. Around her, the other women huddled in small clusters, their faces gaunt from weeks of uncertainty. Most were auxiliary personnel clerks, nurses, telephonists, women who had believed in duty, in service, in a cause that now lay in ruins across Europe. The propaganda they had consumed for years painted Americans as brutal, vengeful, barely civilized. Now they were sailing toward that supposed brutality, and fear sat heavy in every chest. The Atlantic crossing took 11 days. Below deck, they received thin soup, hard bread, and water. Not cruel, but not kind, merely functional. The Geneva Convention was mentioned once by a British officer overseeing their transfer. The words meant little to women, who expected retribution. When the ship finally docked in Galveston, Texas, the heat struck them like a physical blow. October in the Gulf felt nothing like autumn in Germany. The sun hammered down on rust-colored earth as they were led from the dock to waiting trucks. Elsa squinted against the brightness, her dark hair plastered to her forehead with sweat. The landscape looked alien flat, endless, the sky so wide it made her dizzy. The truck convoy rolled through empty highways flanked by scrubland. Through the canvas openings, Elsa caught glimpses of a country untouched by war-intact bridges, whole buildings, fields that had never seen artillery craters. The contrast to the Europe they had left behind was staggering. No rubble, no refugees, no ash. "Where are they taking us?" asked Margot Fisher, a 20-year-old who had worked in a communications unit. Her voice cracked with exhaustion. "To punishment," Greta muttered. "We are enemies. What else would there be?" The camp appeared after 2 hours of driving, a sprawling compound of wooden barracks surrounded by wire fencing, guard towers at each corner. But something was wrong. The structures looked too new, too clean. There were no signs of brutality, no visible instruments of suffering. The American guards who opened the truck gates looked bored rather than hostile. Processing began immediately. Names, ranks, service history, all recorded by a female clerk who spoke broken German and smiled apologetically when she mispronounced their names. They were led to a medical station where an army doctor examined them with clinical detachment, checking for lice, tuberculosis, malnutrition. When he declared Elsa fit, he handed her a card with dietary instructions and said something in English she did not understand. "He says you need to gain weight," translated the clerk. "You will receive 3 meals daily." Elsa stared at the card. 3 meals, daily. The words seemed absurd. Clean uniforms were distributed that evening, not military issue, but simple cotton dresses in gray and blue, with proper undergarments and thick socks. After months in the same stained clothing, the sensation of clean fabric against skin felt almost obscene. Elsa ran her fingers over the stitching, noting its quality. These were not rags meant to humiliate. These were garments made to last. The barracks assigned to the women held 20 beds with actual mattresses, thin but real. Each bed had 2 blankets, a pillow, and a small metal locker. Windows admitted evening light. The floor was swept clean. Compared to the crowded transport ships and temporary holding facilities they had endured, this place resembled a school dormitory more than a prison. "This is wrong," Greta insisted, sitting rigidly on her assigned bunk. "They are deceiving us, making us comfortable before the real punishment begins." Elsa did not argue. She was too tired, and some part of her feared Greta might be right. As dusk settled over the Texas plains, they were led across the compound toward a large wooden structure that served as the mess hall. The path took them past another building smaller, with screens on the windows and smoke rising from a chimney. The kitchen. That was when Elsa first smelled it. Meat. Not the thin, gristly scraps that had flavored their watery soups aboard ship, but real meat. Fatty, rich, cooked with butter or oil. The scent carried on the evening breeze, and despite herself, Elsa's stomach clenched with hunger. Around her, the other women slowed their pace, nostrils flaring. "What is that?" Margot whispered. Through the kitchen's screen door, Elsa glimpsed American soldiers moving around a massive stove. She heard laughter. Genuine, careless laughter. And the sizzle of food in pans. One soldier, a stocky man with rolled-up sleeves, flipped something in a skillet with casual expertise. The motion was so normal, so domestic, it seemed impossible this was happening in a prisoner of war camp. "Keep moving," ordered their escort, a young corporal who barely looked at them. Inside the mess hall, they received their first American meal. Boiled potatoes, canned beans, and bread with margarine. Simple, but more than adequate. The bread was white, softer than any Elsa had eaten in 2 years. She tore small pieces slowly, making it last. Around her, women ate in silence, still uncertain whether this was mercy or mockery. But the smell from the kitchen lingered in her mind. Meat cooking. Real meat. The kind of food that had disappeared from German tables long before the war turned against them. "Tomorrow," said one of the guards in stilted German. "Breakfast at 7. Line forms outside. None of them slept well that first night. The beds were too soft after months of hard surfaces. The quiet was too complete, no artillery in the distance, no air raid sirens, no shouted orders, just the endless chirping of Texas crickets and the occasional footsteps of guards on patrol. Elsa lay awake, staring at the wooden ceiling beams. She thought of her mother in Hamburg, if she was still alive. She thought of the hospital where she had worked until the bombs came. She thought of the propaganda films she had watched, showing American soldiers as monsters. And she thought about that kitchen and the smell of meat cooking, and wondered what tomorrow would bring. Dawn broke over the camp with the harsh clarity of Texas light. Elsa woke before the wake-up call, her body still attuned to military schedules. Around her, the other women stirred slowly, adjusting to freedom from immediate danger even as they remained imprisoned. At 6:45, the smell began. It drifted through the barracks' open windows like an invisible force, savory, smoky, impossibly rich. Elsa sat up on her bunk, inhaling deeply, despite herself. Beside her, Margot was already standing at the window, gripping the sill. "What is that?" Margot breathed. "It smells like before the war, like Christmas." Greta approached the window as well, her expression suspicious. "It is a trick. They are trying to weaken us with desire." But even Greta's voice lacked conviction. The smell was too powerful, too real, too laden with memory and longing. It spoke of a world where people had enough food, enough fuel, enough peace to cook something slowly, carefully, with attention to flavor, rather than mere survival. The guard's whistle blew at 7 sharp. Breakfast formation. They filed out into the already warm morning, joining the orderly line forming outside the mess hall. The American guards looked half awake, drinking coffee from tin cups. One of them yawned. Another checked his watch with obvious boredom. None of them appeared to be preparing for cruelty. As the line moved forward, Elsa found herself walking past the kitchen again. Through the screen door, she saw the same stocky soldier from yesterday, the one with expert hands. He was tending a massive griddle, and on it, strips of meat sizzled and popped, rendering fat into the metal surface. The smell was overwhelming now, making her mouth water involuntarily. "Bacon," said a voice in accented German. Elsa turned to see another guard, older, with gray at his temples, standing nearby with his coffee. He gestured toward the kitchen. "American bacon. Sergeant Morrison makes the best in camp." Elsa did not know the word bacon in English, but she understood meat. She nodded mutely. Inside the mess hall, long tables were already set with metal trays and utensils. The women found seats, uncertain and watchful. Then the kitchen doors swung open, and two soldiers wheeled out carts laden with food. What they placed on the tables seemed impossible. Stacks of bread, toasted golden, pots of scrambled eggs, still steaming, pitchers of milk, real butter, in small dishes, and on every plate, 3 strips of that meat, the bacon glistening with rendered fat, edges crisp and dark. "Holy Mary," whispered Margot. The American soldiers gestured for them to eat, speaking in English none of them fully understood. But the message was clear. This was not punishment. This was breakfast. Elsa picked up a strip of bacon with trembling fingers. It was still hot, leaving grease on her skin. She brought it to her nose, inhaling the smoky sweetness. Around her, 22 other women did the same, each moving with the slow deliberation of people who could not quite believe what they held. The first bite exploded across her tongue with a richness she had almost forgotten existed. Salt, fat, smoke, sweetness, all at once. The meat was crisp on the outside, tender within, nothing like the stringy horse meat or mystery rations of the last years. This was food made by people who had choices, who could afford to discard the inferior, who lived in a world where meat could be more than sustenance. Elsa chewed slowly, and something broke inside her chest. "Is this?" Elsa heard herself speaking before she realized she intended to. The words came in German. Quiet. Addressed to no one, and everyone. "Is this the flavor of freedom?" The silence that followed was profound. 23 women stopped eating mid-bite. The American soldiers paused in their serving. Even the morning birds outside seemed to hold their breath. Sergeant Morrison, the man who had cooked their breakfast, approached their table. He was perhaps 40, with strong hands and a weathered face that suggested years of hard work. He looked at Elsa with something like understanding, though she doubted he spoke German. "Ma'am," he said gently. Elsa tried English, cobbling together words from her limited schooling. "This is freedom taste?" One of the interpreters, a young corporal named Davis who had studied languages, translated for Morrison. The sergeant listened. Then his face softened into something almost sad. He looked at the women at the table, at their thin frames and haunted eyes, at the way they clutched their bacon as if it might vanish. "Tell them," Morrison said slowly, "it's just breakfast. Tell them in America, people eat like this every day. Tell them this is normal." Davis translated, but his voice wavered on the word normal. Elsa set down her bacon and pressed her hands to her face. Around her, other women began to weep, not from sadness, but from the vertigo of having their world inverted. Everything they had been told was wrong. The enemy was feeding them better than their own government had in years. The barbarians possessed abundance they could barely remember. Greta sobbed openly, her resistance finally crumbling. "How long?" she demanded in German. "How long have they been eating like this while we starved?" No one answered. The question was too large, too painful. Morrison watched them cry and did not look away. When Davis started to apologize, to say something comforting, the sergeant raised a hand. "Let them," he said quietly. "Let them feel it." After several minutes, Elsa wiped her eyes and picked up the bacon again. She ate it slowly, tasting every fiber, forcing herself to acknowledge what it represented. Not just food, but capacity. Not just a meal, but a system that could afford mercy, even to its enemies. The other women followed her lead, eating through their tears. The breakfast continued in near silence, broken only by the soft sounds of cutlery and the occasional shuddering breath. When the meal ended, Morrison approached their table again. Through Davis, he spoke. "You will eat like this every day you are here. 3 meals. All of them will be real food. This is the rule." Elsa met his eyes. "Why?" she asked in German, knowing Davis would translate. "We are your enemy." Morrison was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something Davis translated carefully. "Because you are human beings. And because we can." The simple declaration carried more weight than any propaganda speech Elsa had ever heard. This was not posturing or strategy. This was simply what they believed. As they filed out of the mess hall into the growing heat of the day, Elsa turned back once. Morrison was already preparing for the next meal, moving around his kitchen with the calm efficiency of a man who had cooked 1,000 breakfasts and would cook 1,000 more. She understood then what freedom tasted like. It tasted like enough. Enough food. Enough peace. Enough abundance that mercy became possible. It tasted like a world where breakfast was ordinary, where no one had to choose between feeding soldiers and feeding prisoners. It tasted like bacon, smoky and rich, and impossibly generous. And it tasted like shame, for believing the lies, for not questioning sooner, for participating in a system that had brought her here. But most of all, it tasted like hope, the terrible, fragile hope that perhaps the world after this war might be different. The days that followed breakfast fell into an unexpected rhythm. Wake at 6:30, formation at 7, meals that continued to astound, not always bacon, but always real, always sufficient. Lunch brought sandwiches with actual meat, vegetables that were fresh rather than spoiled, soup that contained more than water and wilted greens. Dinner varied, sometimes beef stew, sometimes pork chops, sometimes roasted chicken with potatoes. The women ate carefully at first, still uncertain if this was temporary indulgence before harsher treatment began. But as days became weeks, their bodies responded to adequate nutrition. Color returned to hollow cheeks, wounds healed. Exhaustion lifted gradually, replaced by something resembling energy. Elsa found herself drawn to conversations with the guards, not from strategy, but from genuine curiosity. The young interpreter, Corporal Davis, proved willing to talk during his breaks. He was from Ohio, had studied German literature in college, and had been drafted in 1943. "Did you read Goethe?" Elsa asked one afternoon, using her halting English and his improving German to bridge the gap. "Some. I preferred Rilke." Davis smiled. My professor would have loved this irony. Me using German poetry to talk to actual Germans in Texas. The conversation was surreal. Here was her enemy, quoting her language's poets, treating her war service as simply another aspect of her history rather than a crime requiring punishment. Other guards showed similar attitudes, not friendship exactly, but a casual respect that contradicted everything she had expected. Margot, who had been so frightened during transport, began helping in the camp library. The Americans had established a small collection of books, mostly English, but some German texts acquired from before the war. She spent hours organizing them, creating a system, occasionally reading aloud to women who struggled with English. Even Greta softened. The radio operator who had predicted torture found herself assigned to help maintain the camp's communication equipment, a job that utilized her skills while keeping her occupied. The American signals corporal overseeing her work treated her as a colleague rather than a prisoner, asking her opinion on technical matters, occasionally sharing his lunch. The transformation was not universal or simple. Some women remained bitter, resentful of their captivity, despite its mildness. Others struggled with guilt. How could they accept kindness from the enemy when their families still suffered in Germany? The psychological complexity of their situation defied easy resolution. But the meals continued, 3 times daily, and with them came a slow erosion of certainty. One evening, as Elsa sat in the barracks writing in the journal she had been given, Margot approached hesitantly. "I need to ask you something," Margot said quietly, glancing around to ensure privacy. "Are we betraying our country? By accepting this?" Elsa set down her pencil. "By accepting food? By accepting their kindness? By starting to like them?" Margot's voice dropped to a whisper. "I laughed today." At something Corporal Davis said. I laughed, and I realized I have not laughed since before the war, and then I felt sick with guilt. The confession hung between them. Elsa understood it completely, the vertigo of having your enemy treat you better than your own leaders had. The confusion of finding humanity where you expected brutality. "I think," Elsa said slowly, "that perhaps everything we were told was designed to make us accept the unacceptable." If Americans are monsters, then we are justified in any action. But if they are simply people with farms and families and favorite poems, then what does that make us? Margot sat down heavily on the nearest bunk. I do not want to think about that. Neither do I. But we must. The conversation marked a turning point in the barracks. Women began speaking more openly about their doubts, their confusion, their slow recognition that propaganda had shaped their entire understanding of the world. Not all accepted this shift. Some clung to old certainties, insisted the kindness was manipulation, predicted inevitable betrayal. But more and more, in quiet conversations after lights out, they acknowledged the truth. Their enemy had more mercy than they had been taught to expect, and that recognition changed something fundamental in how they saw themselves. By November, the camp had developed its own peculiar culture, a hybrid space where German prisoners and American guards coexisted in surprising normality. Work assignments began in earnest. The Geneva Convention mandated that prisoners could be employed in non-military labor, and the Americans took this seriously, establishing various programs. Elsa volunteered for the medical unit, assisting the camp doctor with routine care for both prisoners and guards. Dr. Patterson, a family physician from Georgia drafted into service, welcomed her nursing experience. They communicated through a mixture of English, German, and medical Latin, developing a working vocabulary that transcended language barriers. "You studied in Hamburg?" Patterson asked one afternoon as they inventoried supplies. "Yes, 3 years before the war. I wanted to specialize in pediatrics. After this is over, you should continue. The world will need good nurses to rebuild." The casual assumption that she had a future, that the war would end, and she would return to life struck Elsa deeply. Patterson spoke of after as if it were certain, as if peace would come and normal existence would resume. Other women found different roles. Some worked in the camp garden, growing vegetables that supplemented their meals. Others helped with laundry, sewing, maintenance work. Each assignment came with a small wage, not real money, but camp script that could be used at the canteen for small luxuries. Chocolate bars, soap, writing paper, magazines. The canteen itself was revelation. That prisoners could purchase treats, could exercise choice about small pleasures, seemed impossible. Yet every Saturday, women lined up to spend their scrip on items that represented normalcy: a candy bar, a tube of lipstick, a popular magazine. Elsa bought soap her first week. Real soap that smelled like flowers rather than lye and ash. She used it sparingly, rationing the luxury, making each shower an occasion. Later, she bought writing paper and began keeping detailed journals not just of camp life, but of her thoughts, her transforming understanding, her attempts to process what was happening to her worldview. "Freedom sometimes begins with a breakfast," she wrote one evening. "But it continues in the small choices we are given. The choice to work or rest. The choice to buy soap or candy. The choice to speak or remain silent. These tiny permissions accumulate into something larger: the recognition that we are still human, still capable of preference and agency, still more than our uniforms and our crimes." The camp operated on routines that were boring in the best possible way. Wake, breakfast, work detail, lunch, rest period, more work, dinner, free time, lights out. The predictability itself was comforting after years of chaos. No bombs fell. No orders came to pack up and evacuate within hours. No sudden violence interrupted their days. Morrison's kitchen continued to astound. Thanksgiving brought turkey, an American tradition the German women did not understand until Davis explained. The feast was absurd. Roasted bird, stuffing, mashed potatoes, cranberry sauce, pumpkin pie. The prisoners ate until they could not move, laughing at their own discomfort, marveling at a country that could afford such excess, even during war. In Germany, Greta said quietly during that meal, "People are burning furniture to stay warm. They are eating bark soup. And we are here, eating turkey." No one replied. The guilt was shared, unspoken, impossible to resolve. December brought cooler weather and Christmas preparations. The Americans erected a tree in the mess hall, decorated it with paper chains and popcorn strings. They invited the German women to add their own decorations, and slowly, tentatively, the prisoners contributed folded paper stars, braided straw ornaments, things remembered from childhood. On Christmas Eve, Morrison prepared a special dinner. Ham with pineapple, roasted potatoes, green beans, rolls with butter, and apple pie for dessert. As the women ate, someone began singing Still Nacht, Silent Night in German. The Americans listened quietly, and when the song ended, one of the guards began the English version. The two languages wove together in the mess hall, carrying the same melody, the same plea for peace. Elsa wept into her napkin, trying to hide the tears. But around her, others cried openly. These were not tears of sadness, but of overwhelming recognition that despite everything, war, propaganda, nationality, uniform, they were all simply people, longing for the same things: safety, home, peace. After dinner, Morrison approached their table with a plate of cookies. He set them down without ceremony, then said through Davis, "My mother used to make these. I thought you might like them." The gesture was so simple, so human, it broke something in Elsa's chest. She took a cookie, buttery, sweet, still warm, and tasted kindness, so pure, it had no agenda. Morrison did not want gratitude or cooperation or intelligence. He simply wanted to share something his mother had taught him. "Thank you," Elsa managed in English. "Thank you very much." Morrison nodded and returned to his kitchen. But the memory of that moment would stay with her for the rest of her life. The moment when the enemy became simply a man who missed his mother and wanted to share cookies. January 1945 brought news that fractured the fragile peace inside the wire. The Battle of the Bulge had ended in German defeat. Allied forces were pushing deeper into Germany itself, and most devastating reports began filtering through about conditions in German cities: Dresden, Hamburg, Cologne. The bombing campaigns had intensified. Civilians were dying in firebombs and rubble. The camp commander allowed prisoners to receive censored letters. When Elsa's first letter arrived from her mother, forwarded through Red Cross channels, her hands shook so badly she could not open it. Davis, sensing her distress, offered to help. The letter was brief, written in her mother's careful script. "My dear Elsa, we received word you are alive and captured. This is better than we feared. Here things are very difficult. We have little food. The apartment is damaged but standing. Your father's pharmacy is destroyed. We survive. Please do not worry. We are managing. Remember, you are loved." The words "little food" struck Elsa like a fist. That morning, she had eaten bacon, eggs, toast with jam, and coffee with real cream. She had seconds. She had complained silently that the eggs were slightly overcooked, and her parents were starving. The contradiction was unbearable. She excused herself from her work detail, retreated to the barracks, and lay on her bunk staring at the ceiling. Greta found her there an hour later. "You got a letter," Greta said. "It was not a question. My family is starving, and I am eating bacon." Elsa's voice was flat. "How can this be right?" Greta sat on the adjacent bunk. "It cannot be right. But it is not our fault. We did not choose this, did we not?" Elsa turned to face her. "We chose to serve. We chose to believe what we were told. We chose not to question when Jewish neighbors disappeared, when the government took more and more control, when war seemed like the only path forward. We were young. We knew nothing. That is not an excuse. Ignorance we chose is still choice." The conversation opened a wound that ran through the entire barracks. As more letters arrived, more women learned that their families suffered while they lived in relative comfort. The psychological torment was acute guilt for being captured, guilt for being fed, guilt for surviving when loved ones struggled. Some women grew angry, directing their frustration at the Americans. "You bomb our cities but feed us." One prisoner spat at Davis during mail distribution. What kind of morality is this? Davis, to his credit, did not defend or deflect. I do not know, he said quietly. I truly do not know how to reconcile it. Others withdrew into silence, refusing to participate in activities, eating minimally, performing work duties mechanically. The camp psychiatrist, a gentleman named Dr. Klein, himself of German heritage, began conducting regular sessions, trying to help prisoners process their complex emotions. It is normal, Dr. Klein told Elsa during one session, to feel guilty for surviving. But you must understand you did not create this situation. You cannot change what is happening in Germany from here. What you can do is stay alive, stay sane, and remember what you learn here. What am I learning? Elsa asked bitterly. That my enemy is kinder than my own government? Perhaps you are learning that the word enemy is more complicated than propaganda suggests. The observation was both obvious and profound. Elsa thought about it constantly in the following days. She watched Morrison cook breakfast with the same care whether he was feeding guards or prisoners. She saw Dr. Patterson treat a German woman's infected wound with the same attention he gave American soldiers. She observed Davis translating letters that contained devastating news, his face reflecting genuine sorrow for their pain. These men did not act like people who hated her. They acted like people doing a job, yes, but more than that, like people who believed in certain principles that transcended nationality. The Geneva Convention was not just rules to them. It represented a conviction that even in war, even toward enemies, basic human dignity must be preserved. One afternoon, Elsa approached Morrison in the kitchen. He was preparing dinner, chicken and dumplings, stirring a massive pot with methodical patience. Sergeant Morrison, she said carefully in English. May I ask question? He looked up, surprised but not unwelcoming. Sure. Ma'am, why you cook so good for prisoners? Morrison considered the question seriously. My daddy owned a diner back home. He taught me that if you are going to cook for people, you cook the best you can. Every time. Does not matter if they are paying customers or hungry strangers or prisoners of war. A meal made with care is a form of respect. Elsa did not have the English to explain how deeply this philosophy affected her. She simply nodded, thanked him, and returned to her duties. But the words echoed in her mind. A meal made with care is a form of respect. That evening, she wrote in her journal, perhaps this is what we lost in Germany. The understanding that every human being deserves respect, regardless of who they are or what they have done. We convinced ourselves that some people were less human and that made everything else possible. Here, even as prisoners, we are treated as people first. This should not be revolutionary. It should be normal. But it is not normal. And recognizing that is devastating. February brought an unexpected event that would become legendary in camp memory. Morrison announced through Davis that he was organizing a special breakfast, a bacon day, to celebrate nothing in particular, except the arrival of a large shipment of premium pork from a Texas supplier. What is purpose? Greta asked suspiciously. Davis shrugged. Sergeant Morrison likes to cook. He got good ingredients. He wants to make something special. That is really all there is to it. The simplicity of the explanation was somehow perfect. Not propaganda, not strategy. Just a cook who enjoyed his craft and had the resources to do it well. Bacon Day arrived on a Saturday morning. The women woke to the now familiar but still intoxicating smell of frying pork. But this time, the quantity was staggering. Morrison had prepared what seemed like hundreds of strips, along with pancakes, maple syrup, scrambled eggs with cheese, toast, fresh fruit, and coffee. The mess hall tables groaned under the bounty. American guards and German prisoners sat together not by regulation, but by the natural mingling that had developed over months of proximity. Morrison moved between tables, ensuring everyone had enough, occasionally adding an extra pancake to someone's plate with a smile. Elsa sat between Margot and a young American corporal named Bennett who was trying to learn German. He pointed at the syrup and attempted. A horn syrup? Yes. Maple syrup, Elsa confirmed, then demonstrated. A horn syrup ist sehr süß. Very sweet. Got it. Bennett poured syrup liberally over his pancakes, then offered the pitcher to Margot. who accepted it with a shy smile. The meal itself was extraordinary, but what struck Elsa most was the atmosphere. People were laughing, actual, genuine laughter. The German women giggled as they attempted English phrases. The American guards joked about Morrison's pancakes being thick enough to use as frisbees. Someone dropped a fork, and instead of tension, there was only good-natured teasing. For 2 hours, nationality and war receded. There were only people eating a good meal together, sharing a table, finding humor and connection in the simplicity of food. Toward the end of breakfast, Morrison emerged from the kitchen looking satisfied. Davis called for attention, then translated as Morrison spoke. "I know you folks have been through a lot. I know many of you have family back in Germany who are struggling. I cannot fix that. No one here can. But what I can do is make sure that while you are here, you eat well. That is in my power. And it matters." The speech was not eloquent or dramatic. Morrison was not a poet or philosopher. He was simply a cook stating his convictions plainly. But the honesty of it resonated through the hall. Elsa raised her hand tentatively. Davis nodded permission for her to speak. "Sergeant Morrison," she said in halting English, we thank you. Not just for food. For." She struggled to find the word, then switched to German for Davis to translate. "For treating us like we matter. For caring about the quality of what you make for us. For believing that prisoners deserve good food. It would be easier to give us less. Cheaper. Faster. But you do not take the easy path. You take the right path. This is something we lost in my country. We forgot that everyone matters. Your breakfast every morning reminds us. It reminds us we are still human, still worthy of care. This is more important than you know." The silence that followed was profound. Several women wiped their eyes. Morrison shifted uncomfortably, unused to such direct appreciation, then nodded slowly. "You are welcome, ma'am. All of you." As the meal concluded and prisoners returned to their duties, Elsa felt something shift inside herself, a fundamental reorientation of understanding. She had entered this camp believing herself unworthy of kindness, expecting punishment as just consequence. But these months of consistent care, of meals prepared with attention, of small dignities preserved, had taught her something crucial. Mercy was not weakness. Generosity was not gullibility. Treating enemies with humanity was not betrayal of your own side. It was affirmation of values, worth defending. The bacon, in its own absurd way, had become a symbol. It represented abundance, yes, but also choice. America could choose cruelty and still comply with conventions, but it chose something more. It chose to exceed minimum requirements. It chose to remember that prisoners were people first. That evening, Elsa added to her journal, "Today I understood that strength is not just military power or industrial capacity. Strength is also the ability to be generous when you could be cruel, to show mercy when vengeance would be easier, to preserve humanity when war encourages us to abandon it. America has this strength. We lost it, if we ever had it. And that is why we lost the war, not because of weapons or tactics, but because we lost sight of basic human value." The recognition was devastating and liberating in equal measure. Spring 1945 brought news that arrived like earthquakes. Hitler dead, Germany surrendered, war in Europe over. The women gathered in the mess hall as Davis read the official announcements. Some wept with relief. Others sat in stunned silence. A few expressed anger that their country had been defeated so completely. Elsa felt only exhaustion. The war was over. They had lost. Everything they had endured, every sacrifice, every privation, all of it, had led to total defeat. But beneath the exhaustion was something else. Relief that the killing had finally stopped. Processing for release began immediately. The camp would not empty overnight. Repatriation was complicated, requiring coordination with occupation authorities, verification of identities, arrangements for transport back to a Germany now divided into occupation zones. but the fact of eventual freedom became certain. One afternoon in late May, the camp commander called the German prisoners to assembly. Through Davis, he explained the repatriation process. Each woman would receive documentation verifying her treatment according to Geneva Convention standards. Each would receive a small package of supplies, basic toiletries, some preserved food, a set of clean clothing, and each would receive a letter from the camp administration. These letters, the commander said through Davis, are not about politics or forgiveness. They simply state that you behaved appropriately during your time here, that you worked hard, that you caused no problems. They may help you as you rebuild your lives, or they may not, but you have earned them. The ceremony felt surreal. Elsa received her documents in a manila envelope papers, declaring her a former prisoner of war, certified healthy, cleared for return. Inside was also the letter, signed by the commander and Dr. Patterson, stating that Elsa Müller had served as a medical assistant in camp, had demonstrated professional competence and good conduct, and could be recommended for future nursing positions. The paper felt heavy in her hands. An American military officer was vouching for her character. The irony was almost too much. The night before her transport group departed, Morrison prepared a final special dinner. He made schnitzel, not authentic German schnitzel, but his American interpretation of it, served with fried potatoes and green beans. The gesture was touching in its imperfection. He was trying to give them something familiar, something that tasted like home. After dinner, Elsa approached Morrison one last time. He was cleaning his workspace, methodical as always. "Sergeant Morrison, I need to tell you," she began in English, then continued in German, trusting Davis would translate. "When we arrived here, I expected cruelty. I expected punishment and hunger and humiliation. Instead, you fed me. Every morning you cooked with care. You treated me like I was worth the effort. This changed me. It changed how I understand what it means to be strong, to be good, to be civilized. I cannot repay this, but I will remember it. When I go back to Germany and see the destruction we caused, when I face what we became, I will remember that humanity is still possible. Because you showed me. With bacon and eggs and pancakes, you showed me." Morrison listened to the translation, his weathered face thoughtful. Then he extended his hand. Elsa shook it the first time she had touched an American guard outside of medical contexts. "You take care of yourself, ma'am," Morrison said quietly. "And when you get home, you help rebuild. Make something better." "I will try." The handshake held for a moment longer. Then Morrison returned to his cleaning. But as Elsa walked back to the barracks, she felt the weight of his words. Make something better. It was both command and permission, a challenge to take what she had learned and use it to build something worth preserving. The next morning, 23 German women boarded trucks for the journey to the port. As they drove through the camp gates for the last time, Elsa looked back at Morrison's kitchen. Smoke rose from the chimney as he prepared breakfast for the remaining guards and prisoners. The sight made her throat tighten. Freedom, she had learned, had a flavor. And she had tasted it in an enemy's camp, served by an enemy's hands, given freely to someone who had no right to expect mercy. That flavor was bacon, smoky and rich and generous beyond reason, and she would carry it with her forever. The ship crossing the Atlantic in June 1945 was crowded with returning prisoners, displaced persons, and refugees, a floating mass of humanity trying to find its way home. Elsa stood at the rail, watching the gray water pass beneath the hull, and thought about the journey in reverse. She had crossed this ocean expecting brutality. She was returning, having experienced the opposite. Hamburg, when they finally arrived, was unrecognizable. Whole neighborhoods had been erased by bombing. The apartment building where she had grown up was partially collapsed, its roof gone, windows vacant. But her parents were alive, thin, exhausted, but alive. Her mother embraced her at the doorway of their damaged apartment, sobbing into her shoulder. "We thought we would never see you again. We thought you were dead. I am here. I am home." Her father stood back, examining her with the clinical eye of a pharmacist. "You look healthy." "They fed you?" "Yes, Papa. They fed me very well." The family's questions came slowly, carefully, as if afraid of the answers. What was America like? How were you treated? Did they hurt you? Were you punished? Elsa answered truthfully and watched disbelief bloom on their faces. She showed them the letter from the camp commander. She described Morrison's kitchen, the bacon on Saturday mornings, the library, the small wages they earned, the Christmas celebration. "But why?" her mother asked, confused. "Why would they treat enemies so well?" "Because they believe every person has dignity. Even prisoners. Even enemies." Her father shook his head slowly. "We were told Americans were barbarians, that they would torture and starve. Captured Germans. I know. I believed it too. I was wrong." The conversation marked the beginning of a long, painful reckoning. All around Hamburg, returning soldiers and prisoners brought similar stories of American camps where food was adequate, where medical care was provided, where violence was rare. These accounts contradicted years of propaganda, forcing German civilians to confront how thoroughly they had been deceived. Elsa found work at a hospital run by British occupation forces. Her American recommendation letter helped considerably proof that she had maintained her nursing skills, that she was reliable and professional. The hospital was overwhelmed with patients, malnutrition, tuberculosis, wounds that had festered without treatment, psychological trauma. She worked 16-hour days, exhausted and heartbroken by the scale of suffering. Germany was destroyed physically, economically, morally. The crimes committed in their name were emerging in full horror: concentration camps, mass murder, systematic atrocity. The propaganda had been wrong about America, but it had also hidden truths about Germany itself. One evening, after a particularly brutal shift, Elsa sat in the hospital's break room with a cup of weak tea. A British nurse named Catherine sat across from her, looking equally exhausted. "How do you keep going?" Catherine asked quietly. "Seeing this every day?" Elsa considered the question. "I remember what is possible. I spent months in an American camp where I was treated with dignity I did not deserve. If they could show mercy to their enemies, then surely I can show compassion to my own people." "You were in America?" "Texas. A prisoner of war camp." Catherine's eyebrows rose. "What was it like?" "Better than it had any right to be." Over the following weeks, Elsa found herself telling her story repeatedly to colleagues, to patients, to neighbors trying to make sense of the post-war world. Each time, she emphasized the same points: the adequate food, the medical care, the small dignities preserved, Morrison's kitchen. "They showed us that strength includes mercy," she would say. "That civilization means treating even enemies as human. This is what we lost. This is what we must learn again." 6 months after her return, Elsa made a decision. She used her meager savings to rent a small storefront near the hospital. The space was damaged, windows broken, floor scarred by fire, but the structure was sound. She spent weeks cleaning, repairing, painting. In November 1945, she opened a small cafe. The menu was extremely limited. Rationing was still severe, but she managed to acquire bread, coffee, and, rarely, a little butter or jam. The cafe served hospital staff, refugees, occupation soldiers, anyone who needed a place to sit and rest. She named it Das Frühstück, the breakfast. Above the door, she hung a small sign in both German and English: "Everyone welcome. Everyone equal." The cafe struggled financially. Food was scarce, customers had little money, and competition for resources was fierce. But Elsa persisted, remembering Morrison's philosophy: if you are going to cook for people, cook the best you can, every time. Then in early 1946, something remarkable happened. A package arrived from America, from Texas. Specifically, inside was a letter from Corporal Davis and a care package: coffee, canned milk, sugar, and, incredibly, a pound of bacon. Davis's letter explained. Sergeant Morrison and I remembered you. We heard that Germany is still struggling with food shortages. We wanted to help. Morrison particularly wanted you to have bacon. He said you would understand why. Elsa stood in her empty cafe, holding a pound of American bacon, and wept. That Saturday, she prepared a special breakfast. The bacon was carefully rationed, just a small strip for each customer, alongside bread and coffee. But the smell filled the cafe, drifting into the street, drawing people in. An elderly woman sat at the counter, staring at her plate. I have not smelled bacon in 4 years. Neither had I, Elsa said quietly, until I went to America as a prisoner. The woman looked up sharply. They fed you bacon? While we starved? Yes. And it taught me something important. What could bacon possibly teach you? Elsa sat beside her. That mercy is a choice, that we can choose to see enemies as humans. That strength includes generosity. That peace begins not with treaties, but with breakfast, with the decision to feed someone who has no claim on your kindness. The woman was quiet for a long moment, then took a small bite of her bacon. Tears ran down her weathered cheeks. Over the following months, Das Frühstück became something more than a cafe. It became a gathering place for people trying to process the war's aftermath, trying to understand how to rebuild not just buildings but civilization itself. British and American occupation soldiers ate there alongside German civilians. Former prisoners shared stories. Refugees found temporary community. And always, when Elsa could acquire it, she served bacon not as a luxury, but as a symbol of what was possible when people chose humanity over hatred. One afternoon in 1947, an American jeep pulled up outside the cafe. Elsa looked up from wiping tables to see a familiar face, Corporal Davis, now a civilian, wearing a suit and carrying a briefcase. Davis! She rushed to embrace him. What are you doing here? Cultural liaison for the Occupation Administration. I work on reconstruction programs. He looked around the cafe, smiling. This is wonderful, Elsa. You actually did it. Did what? Made something better. That is what Morrison told you to do, remember? She laughed, wiping her eyes. Is Morrison here too? No, he went back to his diner in Texas, but he sent something. Davis handed her a package. Inside was a leather-bound recipe book, handwritten. Morrison's recipes for bacon, pancakes, eggs, biscuits, all the breakfasts he had cooked in camp. On the first page in careful script, for Elsa, these are not just recipes, they are a philosophy. Everyone deserves a good meal. Everyone deserves respect. Use them well. Morrison. Elsa clutched the book to her chest, overwhelmed. Please, you must write to him. Tell him. Tell him I understand. Tell him that every morning when I cook, I remember what he taught me, that a meal made with care is a form of respect. Davis promised he would. The cafe continued for decades. Elsa never became wealthy, but she built something valuable, a space where former enemies could sit together, where everyone was served with equal care, where the simple act of sharing food became a practice in peace. In 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell, Elsa was 70 years old and still operating Das Frühstück. A journalist came to interview her about her experiences during the war. And inevitably, the conversation turned to her time in Texas. Do you believe it changed you? The journalist asked. Being a prisoner in America, Elsa thought carefully before answering. It gave me back my humanity. I entered that camp believing I was worthless, that I deserved punishment, that the enemy would confirm my darkest fears. Instead, a man cooked me bacon. Such a small thing, breakfast. But it contained everything. Mercy, abundance, the choice to treat prisoners as humans. It showed me what we had lost in Germany, the understanding that every person matters. And it showed me what was possible if we chose differently. And did you? Choose differently? Every day. Every single day since. When Elsa died in 1996, her obituary mentioned her cafe and her nursing career. But at her funeral, people spoke mostly about her conviction that peace began with breakfast, that reconciliation required feeding your enemy until they became your friend. Morrison had died years earlier, but his recipe book was passed to Elsa's nephew, who continued operating Das Frühstück. Above the kitchen doorway, he hung a photograph, a young German nurse and an American sergeant, shaking hands across the divide of war, connected by the simple philosophy that everyone deserves a good meal. Freedom, Elsa had written in her final journal entry, has a flavor. It tastes like bacon, smoky and generous and given freely. It tastes like mercy, when vengeance would be easier. It tastes like the choice to remember our common humanity even when everything encourages us to forget. And once you have tasted it, you can never accept anything less. The war had taken everything from her country, certainty, innocence. But in a Texas prisoner of war camp, over plates of bacon and eggs, she had found something more valuable. Proof that we can choose to be better than our worst moments, that kindness is not weakness, and that civilization is measured not by how we treat our friends, but by how we treat our enemies. Morrison had cooked breakfast. Such a small act, but in its simplicity lay a profound truth, that the world changes one meal at a time, one choice at a time, one moment of mercy at a time, and sometimes revolution tastes like bacon.